80,000 people, every single one of them on their feet, not one empty seat in the entire stadium. And in the center of that stage, a man stands completely still. No dancers behind him. No pyrotechnics, no spectacle, just a crisp black suit, a microphone, and a silence so thick you could feel it pressing against your chest. Then he opens his mouth. And something happens that no one in that crowd can explain afterward. Grown men start to cry, complete strangers reach for each other's hands. People who have never spoken a word of Italian feel every syllable land somewhere deep inside them, like a memory they never lived but somehow recognize. And somewhere in that crowd, someone whispers what everyone else is already thinking. He can't even see us, but somehow he sees us all. That man is Andrea Bocelli. And if you think you already know his story, you don't, not the real one. Because behind that voice, behind that calm, that grace, that impossible sound, there is a story most people were never supposed to hear. A story of a boy the world almost never found. A man who came terrifyingly close to losing everything more than once. And a secret struggle he carried alone for years while millions watched him perform and assumed he had it all. At 67, the full truth is finally coming to light. And what you're about to hear isn't just a success story, it's a story about survival. He was born on September 22, 1958, in a tiny village called Lajatico, tucked into the rolling hills of Tuscany. The kind of place where life moves slowly and quietly, where the air smells like cypress trees and old stone, where the world outside feels very far away. From his very first years, something about Andrea was different. The moment music played, any music, anywhere, he would stop everything he was doing, completely still, head tilted. Listening with an intensity that felt unusual for a child so small. Like the sound was speaking directly to him in a language no one else could hear. His parents noticed. They put him in front of a piano at 6 years old. Within months, it was clear this wasn't just a talented child learning an instrument. This was something else entirely. He wasn't practicing. He was communicating, pouring something out that had no other place to go. But beneath all that beauty, there was something painful waiting. Andrea had been born with congenital glaucoma, a condition that had damaged his vision from the very beginning. He could see, but never fully. The world was always slightly blurred, slightly out of reach. He had learned to live with it, learned to navigate a world he could only partially see. Then came the afternoon that changed everything forever. He was 12 years old, playing football, a sport he genuinely loved, when the ball struck him directly in the face with full force. He collapsed, was rushed to hospital unconscious. When he woke up, the little sight he still had was gone, completely, permanently, and there was nothing anyone could do to bring it back. He was 12 years old, and he would spend the rest of his life in total darkness. No one would have blamed him for breaking, for shutting down, for letting the anger consume him the way it consumes most people who lose that much that young. But Andrea did something that even now is hard to fully explain. He went back to the piano. He buried himself in music the way a drowning person reaches for something solid. Sound became his entire world, the one place where nothing had been taken from him, where he was still whole, still capable, still himself. He learned flute. He trained his voice. And slowly that voice began to reveal what it truly was. He went to university, studied law, graduated, even worked as a court-appointed lawyer for a time. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should, a responsible life, a future that made sense, but the music never stopped calling. It sat inside him like a fire that no amount of routine or responsibility could put out. And eventually, he stopped pretending it wasn't there. By the late 1980s, Andrea Bocelli was living a double life. During the day, a lawyer, composed, professional, doing everything expected of him. But at night, he was in the piano bars of Tuscany, singing for small crowds who sometimes barely looked up, passing a hat, earning just enough to feel like the dream was still breathing. Those nights were humbling in ways that would break most people. Some evenings, the crowd talked straight through his performance. He was a blind man in a smoky room, wondering if this was the sailing, if this was all it was ever going to be. And there were moments, quiet, private moments, when he sat with that question and had no answer. Then one night he heard a recording that rearranged something inside him. Luciano Pavarotti, the greatest Italian tenor alive. That voice filling the room like something that had no right to come from a single human body. Andrea didn't listen with envy, he listened with recognition. Like hearing proof that what he felt inside himself was not a fantasy, was not arrogance, was real and was possible. He made a decision that night, no more halfway. No more piano bars as a backup plan. He would train, seriously, completely, all in. He found a vocal coach. And the progress was staggering in a way that left even experienced teachers searching for words. His voice had qualities that defied simple explanation, a natural warmth, a weight of genuine emotion that no amount of technique alone could manufacture. He wasn't hitting the notes. He was living inside them. In 1992, he recorded a simple demo tape, nothing polished, just his voice, raw and unguarded, laid down in a modest studio. That tape found its way to Zucchero, the legendary Italian rock star who had been searching for months for a voice he couldn't quite describe. When Zucchero pressed play and heard what was on that tape, he sat completely still. He called Andrea immediately. He told him, "I need that voice. I have a duet that's been waiting for exactly what you have." The song was called Miserere. And Andrea walked into that studio unknown, invisible, carrying nothing but his voice and everything he'd held onto through 12 years of darkness and 10 years of smoky bars. But what happened after that recording, no one could have predicted. Pavarotti heard the demo, and he was stopped cold. He made one phone call to Zucchero and said something that would alter the course of Andrea Bocelli's life forever. "I want the blind one," 6 words, from the most famous tenor in the world. And just like that, a door swung open that Andrea had spent his entire life standing outside of. His debut album arrived in 1994. Italy responded immediately and overwhelmingly. Audiences heard in his voice something they hadn't felt in years. Something ancient, something deeply, achingly human. Then came Con ti partiro, a sweeping ballad of longing and departure, written specifically for him. When he performed it at the Sanremo Music Festival in 1995, the reaction in that hall was unlike anything the competition had produced in memory. Re-released as Time to Say Goodbye alongside soprano Sarah Brightman, the song sold over 12 million copies worldwide. Hit #1 across Europe. Became one of the best-selling singles ever recorded. The man who had been passing a hat in Tuscany piano bars just years before was now everywhere. On every stage, on every television. In every home, but no one was prepared for what fame of that size actually costs. Because the moment Andrea crossed into the mainstream, the classical world turned on him. The critics sharpened their pens. The purists pulled back their endorsement. He was too popular to be taken seriously, too emotional for the traditionalists, too classical for pop radio. They gave him a label designed to diminish, crossover, act, as if what he was doing was somehow less than real music, as if the millions of people weeping in concert halls had somehow been fooled. Some called him a gimmick. Some questioned whether his voice was genuine operatic quality or simply powerful emotion dressed up with good production. For a man who had already survived the kind of losses that would have finished most people, those words cut somewhere deep and didn't leave easily. And at the same time, completely out of sight, his personal life was beginning to fracture under a weight he had never prepared for. The truth behind all of it was far more complicated than anyone knew. The late 1990s and early 2000s looked from the outside like pure triumph. Album after album, romanza, sogno, sacred arias. Each one selling millions. Each one performed to standing ovations at the Royal Albert Hall, Madison Square Garden, the Vatican itself. He sang for presidents. He sang for popes. He sang for an entire grieving civilization. After September 11, 2001, when the world didn't have words for what it was feeling, people reached for his recording of Amazing Grace the way they reached for prayer. It became one of the most downloaded pieces of music on the planet in the days that followed. He had become something beyond a recording artist. He had become a place people went when ordinary language failed them. But while the world was holding on to him, Andrea was quietly falling apart in ways none of them could see. His marriage to Enrica Senzatti, the mother of his sons Amos and Matteo, the woman who had stood beside him through the years before anyone knew his name, had been fracturing for a long time. The relentless touring, the months apart, the suffocating pressure of living inside global fame, it had pulled them too far in too many different directions, and eventually there was no pulling back. In 2002, they separated. For Andrea, a deeply Catholic man, a man for whom family was not a value but a foundation, this was not just heartbreak. It was a grief he had no public language for. A failure he absorbed entirely in silence while the whole world watched him take his bows and smile. He said almost nothing publicly. He protected his sons. He protected Enrica. He carried the weight of it alone in the dark in the only way he knew how. And then there was something else, something even fewer people were aware of. For years, Andrea had been quietly living under a pressure that had no name and no audience. Every concert was not just a performance. It was a test. Could he do it again? Could he reach that place again? Could he deliver that same impossible emotional truth night after night after night? And what would happen to him if one night he couldn't? He once described standing in the wings before a major performance and feeling a wave of fear so sudden and so intense that it almost paralyzed him completely. The man the entire world believed was untouchable was standing in the dark, terrified. And then came the moment that shook everyone closest to him. By the mid-2000s, there was a conversation happening in the industry that almost no one outside of it was aware of. Serious questions were being raised about his vocal health. Years of enormous venues, brutal touring schedules, and the sheer physical demands of operatic performance had placed a strain on his voice that could not be ignored. The whispers grew quieter in his presence and louder everywhere else. How long could this last? How long before the one instrument his entire life had been built around began to give way? And at the same time, the ground beneath him had shifted in other ways. The classical world had never fully embraced him. The pop world had moved on to newer faces. He was approaching 50, beloved by hundreds of millions, celebrated everywhere he went, and yet profoundly uncertain in his most private moments of where he truly belonged. He sat with that for a long time, and then he made a decision that surprised nearly everyone around him. He stepped back, not a retirement, not a collapse, but a deliberate, quiet retreat. He returned to Tuscany, to the land he had grown up on, to his horses, which had always given him something that no audience ever quite could. He reconnected with his faith in a way that touring at that pace had made nearly impossible. He reconnected with his sons, and somewhere in the middle of all that stillness, he fell in love again. Her name was Veronica Birdy. She had come into his life years earlier in a professional capacity and over time had become something completely different, something essential. His anchor. The person who understood not just who he was to the world, but who he actually was when the world wasn't watching. She became his fierce protector in ways that not everyone around him appreciated. She pushed back on the industry pressures that had been slowly eroding him. She advocated for his health, his schedule, the integrity of his creative choices. Some in his circle resented it. She didn't adjust her position for a single moment. In 2012, Veronica gave birth to their daughter Virginia. And if there had been any remaining question about whether Andrea Bocelli still had the capacity for pure, uncomplicated joy, the answer was in his face every time he was near that little girl. He and Veronica married in 2014 in a small, private ceremony at the church of Santo Stefano in Lajatico, the same village where a boy had been born 56 years earlier with a voice the world almost never heard. Full circle, but even then something was still coming, one more thing he hadn't yet faced, and it was closer than anyone realized. In 2020, the entire world went silent. And in the middle of that silence, on Easter Sunday, Andrea Bocelli walked alone into the Milan Cathedral. No audience, no orchestra, no one in the pews. Just vaulted stone arches and centuries of quiet and a single man with a microphone. And he sang. Millions of people around the world watched it live from their homes, from their isolation, from their fear. And they wept, not politely, not briefly. They wept the way people weep when something reaches a place inside them that they didn't know could still be reached. Because somehow a blind man singing alone in an empty church made the rest of the world feel less alone. That had always been who Andrea Bocelli truly was, not a spectacle, not a crossover product. Not a category for critics to argue about. A voice that shows up reliably, impossibly, in the exact moment when the world most needs to be reminded of its own humanity. Now at 67, he continues. His son Matteo has found his own voice and carries music into the next generation. His daughter Virginia has begun performing alongside her father, her voice carrying something of his in it that makes audiences catch their breath. The voice that almost never existed has become, quietly and undeniably, a legacy. He once said, "I am a man of few certainties, but of this I am sure, music saves." He would know better than almost anyone alive what that actually means, so here's what I want to know. A boy who lost his sight at 12 years old. A man who spent years invisible, singing in dim bars for people who weren't really listening. A voice that has now reached over 1 billion people across this planet, carrying grief, faith, love, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments. I want to know what you're thinking after hearing all of that. And if this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, the real stories, the ones behind the image, the ones that actually matter, then subscribe. Because this is what we do here every single week. The stories they don't always tell, the ones that stay with you long after you've stopped watching.